Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm here with James Watson of Sales Catapult, powered by Sales Acceleration. James, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Good to be here.
James, why don't you give us a bit about your company and yourself and how you got into this space?
All right. So what I do is I'm an outsourced VP of sales, which is kind of like a fractional part-time sales leader that comes in and works with small to mid-sized businesses that are in need of sales help. They can be, at varying stages from, entering into the market as a pure startup to, wanting to exit and boost up, their revenues, before they do that. The reason that I really got into this, and it kind of goes back to my parents and the influence they had on me early in my life. My father was a very successful attorney. My mom was a former real estate agent, but then, became a stay-at-home mom. And I was actually, very shy and, kind of avoided social situations when I was young with non-family or people that I didn't know really well. And, both my parents, they recognized that. And while they focused always on academics and the importance of that, they realized that it would be good for me to get into sports. To kind of come out of my shell. And little did I know at that time that, what they, set me off on there, would have a big influence on, my, decisions on what I did in life and some of the ways that I was able to overcome challenges, during that time. So one of the defining moments really for me, flashing forward to when I was in high school and I was playing football, and I was in my junior year and I was competing, for the starting quarterback position on varsity against a guy that had been there for 2 years, taking the team to, a championship the prior year. And I was competitive, but, I was, then moved down to JV for a year because I wasn't going to start. And at the time, I was just devastated by it, and and I was upset by it, and somewhat embarrassed by it. But then when I got there, I realized it was actually a very good cast of of teammates, and I decided to embrace it, and ended up having a breakout year. The following year, I came in and I was much more competitive and was actually rotating back and forth as a starter for a few games. Coaches couldn't make a decision, so they took it to a locker room vote, and I was voted, as the starting quarterback. And then I stayed in that position until end of the year, and was able to, beat our crosstown rivals that were undefeated and were heading on their way to a championship. So it was kind of a spoiler moment for them, but it was, a great moment for me. And what that did is it really kind of gave me, a sense of pride and made me realize that all the hard work and, overcoming the adversity was worth it. One of the things, that I really drew on from that I was able to take forward into my business career was when I've had a 30-year career in sales, was when I transitioned from sales to sales management. And I was really able to draw on that, those experiences I had in the adversity to help people to overcome their adversity and to be successful. And frankly, that really became my passion. And so it was really natural for me in the past year, after I'd done some consulting gigs and left corporate America, to start my own consulting company, where I felt that I could really do it on a larger scale and help a lot more companies out, particularly those that couldn't afford to have a full VP of sales or a leader of sales. So I've really learned those lessons and throughout the ups and downs in my life and in business. I've always reflected back on the impact, that my parents had. And to this day, that serves as an inspiration, for what I'm doing right now.
That's a fascinating story, and it kind of ties in with the theme of our podcast and why we're talking with you is the critical nature of process, or at least a system or framework in terms of growing, particularly early stage startups. And I think you highlighted it, right? We're so used to everyone talking about the superstar salesperson. But in your football example, you kind of have emphasized, and I like that you've taken it into your career, process or the willingness to like persevere towards something in a structured way is critical. And that's particularly important for for early growth stage startups. And it's great to think about that. But I think, as I kind of alluded to, right? I think we're so enamored with the superstar salesperson, sales rep. I think a lot of startups think, oh, if I hire this one individual, they'll power my growth, and then I'll IPO. Do you think that startups in general, they seem to make a lot of mistakes with sales? Does it stem from that mentality of if I just hire one superstar salesperson, or is it even more than that? Is it the process? Is it their mentality, or is it all of the above? I think I've given you a loaded question.
Yeah, it's very loaded, but and really it is a little bit of all of the above, and it can vary, by different, situation. There tends to be, I believe, with the startups is usually someone, a man or woman with a great idea. Sometimes, it's a patented idea and it's something that can kind of fly off the shelves initially. And whether they're funding it themselves or whether they are, getting, VC funding, there's a tendency to rely on whatever that product or service is to kind of sell itself. And sometimes the VC even, buy off on that. Problem with that is that, especially if they don't hire a salesperson right away or put a process in place, that they can kind of cruise along, for maybe half a year and do well, but then suddenly it starts, plateauing, and the sales aren't quite where they need to be, and it either puts stress on the individual if they fund it themselves, or now they could get some outside stress, from the VC.
Interesting. And I think you emphasize something that's super important, I think, with early stage startups. There is that jack of all trades, right? Particularly if they're a founder and they're building that product and they've convinced particularly a VC to fund it. And I think we're so enamored, particularly in Silicon Valley, with like the tech bro culture, for lack of a better term, right? Where it's like a superstar founder, they do everything, they put them together a core team. And do you think that that culture, that tech bro culture, has unfortunately created this misconception that it's the individual versus process, when in reality, particularly in sales, but in other aspects, but since sales is your focus, that they should be one and the same, that it's not either or, it's an and in terms of individuals and process?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think that it tends to lean towards the individual, and that individual is important, but it shouldn't be 90 or 100% of what's being done. It should be an equal balance, right out of the gate. And I think a lot of times it's a failure, or an inability to assess, what sales processes are necessary, to be able to achieve long-term objectives. And when I say long-term objectives for a startup, that's a year or maybe 2 years.
Let me probe on that a bit. You say long-term in terms of 1 or 2 years for a founder. So if I'm a founder of maybe with 1 or 2 other individuals, how do I start getting into the mentality of, I need to start developing processes? And I know we're going to focus specifically on sales, but in my encountering of individuals who found startups, process isn't a thing for them. It's more like they're making it up as they're going along, and sometimes justifiably, right? Because they have short runways, etc. But how do we kind of switch from that mentality? It's like, oh, I'm going to give, Bob my sales because I trust him. He was an old friend of mine, etc. To more like, I need Bob not only to power the growth for me, but I also need him to build the process. Like, how do we start building that mentality amongst founders?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and an experience that I've been through myself, having been with startups. So I've witnessed it. And then I've also been brought into startups that are further along when they fail to do that early on. And usually it's a failure to build or implement a solid sales foundation early on. And I think the tendency to do that is just that, kind of like a bunch of lemmings, everyone has done it that way, but when statistics tell you that 90% of startups are likely to fail, it doesn't seem like, a pattern that people should be following. And I think that there's just a tendency initially that, entrepreneurs are expected to and decide to bootstrap it and, do everything themselves and, live like paupers, when the reality is there probably should be some more investment made into the sales effort initially in the process.
Interesting. Let's turn to the other side. So, we focused in this conversation a lot on startup founders, but you've kind of brought up, and I've brought up as well, the venture capital, the investors. Is there anything that those individuals, those investors, those VCs can do to encourage those startup founders to have that right behavior, or start thinking about those sales foundations that you've alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, whatever that level of funding is, it could be 500,000 seed, it could be, when they, get a $5 million round of funding. I believe that the VC, when they're putting that kind of money in, it's a matter of where's the money allocated. And I think a lot of the VC, there's some are starting to get it, but a lot of the VC are thinking the same way that the entrepreneurs do, which is more towards the product and service, as opposed to really, frankly, insisting on there being an equal sales component and process early on. Now, I think that in the past, it's always been cost prohibitive. It's been cost prohibitive, but there has been a big move kind of to the fractional outsource, not just for sales, but for HR, IT, even legal, you name it. And so that's becoming, more and more common and more affordable. So I think it's really just a matter of education, and then, a bit of a paradigm shift to be able to embrace that change. But I believe it would make a huge difference.
And you brought something up there where that fractional model has been applied not only across, I think famously it's in HR, but it's being applied across all different, let's call them back office functions for startups. So it sounds like there's no reason either a startup founder or investor shouldn't insist on having those process available from day one, so they can focus on not only building a great product and service that meets the market needs, but having an organization that is foundationally ready for growth.
Yeah, I believe that's absolutely true on that side of it. And then on the other side of it, one of the big challenges is always, getting funding. And if someone comes in and already has a plan, and lays it out and says, I'm, going to be bringing in, this particular individual, and this is what they're going to be doing, that's going to instill a lot more confidence into the VC, and potentially improve how quickly and how much funding the owner will be able to get.
And I think I should point out that it's not just like, oh, hey, I'm going to hire, for instance, yourself, James, to build the sales foundation. It's they need to start thinking about it. So if you were to tell startup founders and investors what they need to focus on, what are some of the key processes that they should be focusing on and building from day one, whether it's building in their initial pitch deck or as they're dreaming up their new service or product?
Yeah, I think they need to embrace the idea that they can get outside help, and then, to get it, have the conversations and then incorporate that into what their business plan is. Because clearly, if they're going to be getting any funding, or if they're just going to be funding themselves, they need to be thinking a year out, 3 years out, 5 years out. Well, how are they going to get there? And then should they begin with a end in mind and then reverse engineer, what is that going to take? Do they already know what their product or service is going to cost? Do they know how long the sales cycle is going to be? Are they going to be able to get a bead on what the close rates are going to be? These are all important metrics that you can't have on an absolute basis unless you've done it before, but you can be aware of it and then make some intelligent presumptions going forward, and then keep assessing and benchmarking, and then building up that empirical data as you go along, and then shift your business plan by staying flexible.
I think you bring up a good point there, because I've seen enough early stage founder pitch decks where their growth is, they just use the mathematical exponential growth formula. I'm like, no, that's not realistic. Particularly to your point, there's a dramatic difference between business to consumer and business to business. Business to business has longer sales cycles, and there's a lot more due diligence that's done. And I think a lot of startup founders don't necessarily realize that. I think we've talked a lot about the process, but what about when they're hiring, right? Obviously, the startup founder is going to be doing it, or that small team is going to be doing it initially. But when they're ready, when they're getting those investors, when they need someone 100% dedicated to sales, what are some of the key factors or attributes that should they be looking for in a sales individual?
Yeah, so right out of the gate, if an individual owner wants to do the sales themselves, they could get an outsourced business development rep, or go to a third party that will help out with that to kind of boost things until they can get a dedicated rep. But whatever they're going to do, they need to evaluate and define the profile of what type of person they're going to bring in, because they need to hire right. You want to make that first hire the right hire, and one that you can then build on and say, okay, this is what great looks like. We're gonna hire more of this. And I think it's also very important. Two things are really important. One is that they fit into the culture, into the belief system of that company, so they're going to be happy, and that the people hiring them are going to be happy. And then number two, they need to be keenly aware of how to incentivize these folks, to be able to bring them in. And a lot of times the tendency is to go on the cheap, but you really get what you pay for when it comes to a seasoned, sales rep, and they're not cheap. And so sometimes that's why you bring a business development rep in first. But it is important. It's better to spend some of that extra money up front and get the right person, because otherwise, you're in a position where you're still having to do a lot of the work, or compensate for what they're not doing.
I think you on something in your statement about the attributes for hiring the first salesperson, which is culture. So I mean, what else should a startup founder be thinking about when it comes to training and instilling that culture? I'm not talking just like the overall culture, but specifically with sales, because you can't always necessarily hire, to your point, multiple experienced sales reps as you're growing, right? Beyond that first individual, you may need to train individuals up concerning that.
Yeah, and that goes back to kind of the quandary that I think is being faced by most startups, which is, I can't afford to get that person. I've got to pay 90, 100K as a base salary with 2 times that on target earnings right out of the gate. So I'm going to try to maybe bring someone in that's got talent. Well, who's going to assess that, and who's going to bring that talent in? And then more importantly, who's going to train that talent? And then it goes back to, well, I can't afford a sales leader. And without, too shamelessly plugging, what my industry does, that's kind of where the fractional comes in, where someone comes in on a temporary basis and can put together a full training program and help onboard. And then, these types of reps go on the ride-alongs, be involved in week, really conduct the weekly meetings, and then give the executive team debriefs so that they can collaborate and feel like they're really part of the process. And I believe that's critically important. So it can be done, but typically, unless it's a startup where the founder has a lot of sales experience and can do it themselves, they're usually going to be out of their comfort zone, and then they're going to need help.
That makes a lot of sense. I think, especially a lot of founders I've met, they're very much exactly to your point. They're into the old, I like to call it the old engineering mentality of, if they build it, they will come, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is like, no. I mean, we've seen so many examples in technology where no, you can build the best technologically advanced product, but at the end of the day, it's who has the best sales, right? In some respects, or at least marketing, or the holistic package, let's call it, right? But not to undermine the importance of sales.
Yeah.
So James, what I usually like to do is I usually give the last word to my guests. So what are some of the things or some of the takeaways that you want our listeners to take away from our discussion today?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that I think are important right out of the gate. And I mentioned one of them before, which is start with the end in mind, where do you want to be, by this time, then by this time frame, and are you looking to exit? You're looking to be doing this, for 20 years, whatever it is, kind of reverse engineering and figuring out, or getting help to figure out what kind of people do you need in place, how many will you need in place, what kind of comp plans, quotas, metrics are going to need to be in place, and how are you going to measure and assess that. And then looking, if you do have a sales rep in place, take a look at their compensation plan, because if they're not on like something close to a 50-50, the tendency is for founders to kind of overpay on the base and then underpay on the back end incentive side, and that doesn't do them any favors in the long run. And then lastly, if they don't have business development or salesperson in place, they should get one.
Excellent. James, if there are founders listening to this podcast, how and they're interested in fractional sales models, I guess, what's your contact info?
Yeah. So my contact info, and first of all, what I can do for anyone that comes in contact through this podcast is to do a free 10-point written assessment that I send out. It takes like a minute to complete, but it actually gives the founder immediate feedback on where they might need help, and then I get a copy of it too. And then we can have a follow-up meeting where I'm just doing it as a freebie, where we do a 10-minute consult, have a conversation, and I may or may not be right for them right now, and it may be that they need help with their funding, or maybe they need help with marketing first, in which case I will recommend someone in my ecosystem that does that. But if they, it'll also give them an idea of, maybe they do need someone like me right now, or maybe they will in the future.
James, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think you've re-emphasized the importance of having, I guess, the understanding of needing the sales foundations right at the beginning, right? It's not just about building the product or service, but you definitely need a great sales model and foundation in order to power that growth that everyone expects from the sales founder to the investor. So I want to thank you for joining the podcast, and have our listeners reach out to you.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Appreciate it.
Thanks, James.